So hello everyone and welcome to our event Colourism in the UK, which is being held as part of the Entrepreneurship Institute's Festival of Disruptive Thinking. My name is Nina and it's a pleasure to moderate this event and welcome you all here today. Thank you so much for joining us. For those not familiar, the Entrepreneurship Institute supports students, staff and alumni at King's to develop their entrepreneurial mindsets. We believe that everyone can be entrepreneurial and that entrepreneurial people can help to make the world a better place by solving problems to create a healthier, smarter and more equal and sustainable future for all of us. This week's festival showcases our disruptive thinking skill, which is the ability to question and challenge the status quo of established systems to progress new ideas and ways of thinking. We're so delighted that Dr Aisha Phoenix has joined us today to share her experience of this to inspire you, and we also encourage you to check out the other events that are taking place as part of the festival. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. This event is being recorded and will be shared afterwards, so please do mute your mics and turn your cameras off if you prefer not to be on film. You can also enable live captions via the webinar settings. There will be time for a Q&A at the end of the presentation. We expect the presentation to be a maximum of 25 minutes long, so please drop your questions into the chat box as we go through and we'll come to these at the end. And it'd be also great, you can raise your hand or unmute your mic during that Q&A if you've got questions that you would like to ask at the end. Now to introduce our speaker. Dr Aisha Phoenix is a lecturer in social justice in the Faculty of Social Science and Public Policy at King's. She has written articles on colorism and has also been featured in podcasts and documentaries on the topic. So over to you, Aisha, whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much. Nothing is happening. Okay, so it's a pleasure to be here with you all today. Some of you might know what colorism is. For some of you, it might be a new topic that you're not that familiar with. So I'm going to begin by outlining what colorism is. And then I'm going to talk about why colorism is important. Briefly, I'll explore the origins of colorism before moving on to talk about my research with Dr. Nadia Craddock on colorism in the UK. Finally, we'll conclude by thinking about some of the ways in which we can approach challenging colorism. So first of all, what is colorism? It's known by many different terms. Some people might have heard of shadism, pigmentocracy, skin tone bias, or the colour complex. What is it? It's a form of skin shade prejudice in which people with dark skin are discriminated against compared with those from the same ethnicities who have lighter skin shades. Colorism is interesting that it can occur both within and between racialized groups. So someone who's black can also be colorist towards someone else who's black. And some people find that quite a hard concept to grasp. People of color face more discrimination the further they are from features associated with whiteness. So for example, for someone like me who has wide lips or broad nose, very curly hair, dark skin, dark eyes, being further from whiteness means you'll be subjected to more prejudice than those who are closer to whiteness. Why is colorism important? So colorism affects the life chances of people of color, including, which is important, thinking in a context like King's about educational achievement. There are many ways in which this operates, but one of them is the fact that teachers have lower expectations of students with dark skin. And those lower expectations can affect how they then encourage those students, and it can lead to lower attainment. And it can also lead to students with dark skin having fewer years of schooling, leaving school earlier, particularly because no one's encouraging them to stay on. It can also have an impact on job prospects and earning potential. People of color with dark skin, research from the United States has found that people of color with dark skin earn less and have lower status jobs as well. Now, in terms of relationship opportunities, one of the issues with research on colorism is that it's because there's not that much that's been done, particularly in the UK. We don't have data on in every area. So there's not been much work done on the experiences of people of LGBTQ plus people and colorism. But in terms of research on heterosexual couples, and particularly thinking about women's experiences, they often have, those with dark skin often have lower status marriages and lower marriage rates and find it harder to find partners as well. Even in the criminal justice system, colorism has an impact. So people of colour with dark skin are more likely to get longer prison sentences for the same crimes of people of the same ethnicity who have lighter skin shades. So you can see here that colorism affects so many different aspects of people's lives. Another thing which isn't on this slide, which is important to think about as well, is the fact that colorism is very divisive. It can lead to divisions within people of the same ethnicity, and people of the same ethnicity but with different skin shades, and that can be very painful as well. So colorism also has an impact on self-esteem and on mental health, and so that's another way in which it's a very serious issue. And multinational companies exploit the prejudice and those anxieties around self-esteem and issues to do with mental health in order to sell skin lightening products designed to make people feel better about themselves, with the thought that they can become lighter and then benefit from the privileges associated with lightness or beauty associated with lightness. The global skin lightening industry is worth billions of pounds, and it's an issue in the UK. Skin lightening is an issue here, but it's also an issue in many different parts of the world. Some people of colour also use toxic skin lightening products, which might radically change the shade of their skin, but also lead to cancers and other serious issues. So it's a real concern. Dermatologists are also very concerned about the impact of some of the bleaching and skin lightening creams on the market, and particularly on the illegal markets. You can see from those articles there that it's very pervasive. There's an example from Nigeria, from Jamaica, China, Malaysia, the Philippines, South Korea, India, where you have people of colour. Unfortunately, you often have the issue of skin lightening. So although colorism is an issue that affects people of colour all around the world, and both men and women, in the UK media, the focus has largely been on Black women's experiences of colorism. And Black women have shared their experiences in documentaries, podcasts, blogs, articles, talking about pressure to bleach their skin, being disadvantaged in the relationship market, being treated differently in families. And also some celebrities have talked about being seen as too dark for the music industry. For example, the singer Beverly Knight, who some of you might have heard of, said that she was maybe too dark for success in the music industry. She said it was easier to market someone who was much lighter with more European features. Similarly, Alexandra Burke, who won the X Factor a number of years ago, discussed her experiences of colorism when she joined the music industry.
The music industry is such a funny little place. I love singing, I love what I do, but if it wasn't for the love that I have for music, I definitely wouldn't be in this industry. And a few reasons are, I got told when I first won the X Factor at 19, I got told, right, because you're Black, you are going to have to work 10 times harder than a white artist because of the colour of your skin. You can't have braids, you can't have an afro, you can't have anything that basically is my identity. You have to have hair, for example, that appeals to white people so people can understand you better. I mean, I was only 19 years old. There's only so much you can understand at 19 when your life is completely changed overnight. And that was quite hard to digest. I got told to bleach my skin. And that was something I refused to do, because it just is absurd to me that somebody could even remotely say to someone, bleach your skin so that you could look whiter. Still to this moment, it breaks my heart that I was told that.
So you can see the pain there as Alexandra Burke talks about those experiences when she just joined the music industry, just won this competition. And it's a competition where you have the public voting for people. So she was voted for as the best singer. So even though the public had said, oh yes, this person's really talented, we really like this person, she was still told she wasn't good enough, and she had to change the shade of her skin and her appearance in order to be more palatable to a predominantly, I suppose, white audience that the music industry was targeting. Black women have also spoken about being underrepresented in the media. And this slide here, I've just put up some examples of US sitcoms and the series Raising Dion. So I'd like you to just have a look. Oh, you can't see them all. Just have a little look at the images of the families in those. There you go. Have a look at the families in those pictures and think about skin shade. Who gets to perform which roles? So you've got Blackish on the top left, Raising Dion, the Netflix hit, on the bottom. Casey Undercover, Family Reunion, My Wife and Kids, and then an older one, Sister. This one here, Sister, Sister. So So here I've now just separated the mothers and fathers from those sitcoms in the series, so you can see the difference between them. And all of the mothers have very, very light skin. Many of them are actually mixed race actresses, and all the men have much darker skin. And it's important to look at this. This shows why it's important to think intersectionally, think about the differences between women and men and their experiences of colorism, because although the ideal and what's attractive there for women is presented as having light skin, it's okay for men, due to the tall, dark and handsome tropes, to have darker skin. What are the origins of colorism? So colorism is a global issue, as I've mentioned before. It has different histories in different parts of the world. However, those histories are contested. Scholars aren't in agreement over exactly how colorism has developed in all different parts of the world. Among the descendants of transatlantic slaves, colorism dates back to the preferential treatment given to those with light skin who were conceived when white slave masters raped or had relationships with black slaves. They were considered more intelligent. They were allowed to work inside as artisans and servants. They were more likely to get a basic education. And again, they were more likely to be released from slavery, in contrast to those with dark skin who were forced to labor in the fields. And those inequalities that started then continued after the abolition of slavery, because those who had light skin already had an advantage because of education and because of skills that was perpetuated, particularly as those people with light skin continued to then find partners with light skin to perpetuate the privilege that they had. In many countries, light skin was also a sign of privilege because it meant that you didn't have to work outside in the sun. So that was a clear way to show that you were of a higher status. In countries colonized by Europeans, colorism exacerbated the preferential treatment already given to those with light skin. Children of local people and colonialists had lighter skin, and they were then rewarded because of their proximity to whiteness, which was associated with power and privilege. They were given extra rewards and privileges. So on to our research on colorism in the UK. Dr. Nadia Craddock and I conducted research between January and July 2019. We had 34 participants, 25 of whom were women, but today I'm going to be focusing on the 9 men. So we did in-depth semi-structured interviews with all of them. And the 9 men were 4 of them, there were 8 Black men and 1 mixed race man, all of them identified as heterosexual. That was just down to who chose to participate. What we sought to explore was how are Black and mixed race men in the UK affected by colorism, and to what extent does colorism affect their sexual desire? The average age of participants was 37 years. 1 of them was a student, the rest were project managers, a doctor, an accountant, strategy consultant, a train operator, and some other professions. Most of them were single. 1 was divorced, 1 was in a relationship, and 1 was married. There were 4 Black African participants, 4 Black Caribbean, and 1 participant who identified as Black mixed race, and he had 1 white parent and an African American parent. Although we didn't set out to divide the interviews in this way, logistically, it turned out that I did all the interviews with the African and African Caribbean men, and Nadia did the interviews with the only mixed race participant, and she is also mixed race, although a different ethnic mix. So in some ways, we benefited from insider status in terms of being able to relate to what the participants were telling us. They might have felt more comfortable because we were of the same, similar or same ethnicities as them. However, it was also a bit more complicated than that. For example, when the African and African Caribbean men were telling me that they found women with dark skin ugly or unattractive, they were talking to a woman with dark skin. So it might have been uncomfortable for them or awkward for them to share some of their views with me as a Black woman researcher with dark skin. So as I mentioned, although Black women's experiences and Black girls' experiences of colorism was what's been prioritized in the media, Black boys and Black men are also subjected to colorism, although we don't hear so much about that. So some of our participants talked about the experience of colorism in their families. For example, Terence said, growing up, you just kind of internalize that idea that lighter is brighter, lighter is better. He said that he had a brother who was always making jokes about his other brother's skin because his other brother was darker than both of them. And it wasn't directed at him, but it never really struck him deeply. But sometimes you just look in the mirror and you're like, wow, I am dark. So hearing those jokes about his brother's skin made him feel uncomfortable about his own skin shade. His brother also told him not to stay in the sun for too long, otherwise he'll get darker, with the implicit idea there that dark skin is something you want to avoid, something negative. Similarly, Andrew said that I can remember my grandmother making references to lighter people being more beautiful. He said, it's what we are taught from when you're younger. You learn those things. And that's really important. That came up in both our interviews with women and men, the idea that families were spaces where the idea of colorism was instilled in young people and then perpetuated. And sometimes family members resisted that. Sometimes they absorbed those ideas and perpetuated colorism themselves. So some of the participants talked about being rejected due to having dark skin. For example, Bilal said, a lot of girls were interested in light-skinned mixed-race boys with the blue eyes, fair skin and fine hair. For a period, I was thinking I would have liked to be lighter in order to obtain the women or obtain the girls, not really because I disliked my skin tone. And that's a really important point. Some people who skin lighten as well would say that they're not doing that because they have a problem with their skin shade. It's that they want the privileges associated with having lighter skin. So as Bilal is saying, he didn't mind his own skin shade, but he wanted to have girlfriends who were attracted to, who would be more attracted to him if his skin was lighter. Malachi also at school said that he was told, you're dark, I don't find you attractive, you're ugly, by a black girl who had lighter skin than him. But because Malachi was very confident in his own skin shade, he challenged that young person and explained to them the problems with perpetuating colorism in this way. And he said, although it doesn't bother me, it does concern me that if someone else was spoken to in this way and they were less secure in themselves, that it could have a very negative impact. So some of the participants who talked about experiencing colorism also perpetuated it. Again, Bilal said, I've obviously experienced colorism and I've also perpetuated it. I'm not proud of that, but growing up, people, whether they were male or female, people who were extremely dark in complexion, shall I say, much darker than I was, people that were my shade or even a bit lighter, would tease and make fun of someone of that complexion. We'd call them blick and this, that and the other. And blick is just a very negative term for someone with very dark skin. Similarly, Isaiah, who had a mixed race brother, Isaiah was black with light skin and he had a brother who was mixed race. So he said he'd experienced colorism when his brother was treated much better than he was. But nonetheless, he said, those who were dark, I treated them less than. I treated them not as nice. And neither Bilal nor Isaiah were proud of this, but I was really glad that they felt comfortable enough to share that. A central theme which came out in interviews with women and men was the idea of black men rejecting women with dark skin. Michael said, a number of black men perceive it that black women aren't good enough for them, so they tend to go with white women. Similarly, Echo said his friends preferred white women, but sometimes dated mixed race women or those with light skin, but they'd never go as far as dating someone black. He said they'd been programmed to think that there's something wrong with black women. Sorry, not that they wouldn't date someone black, that they wouldn't date someone with dark skin, because you can have light skin and be black. He said, if they're willing to dismiss a group of black women and not let those women know that they're pretty and are constantly flocking towards either light-skinned women or just white women, you're telling those other black women, I don't find you attractive and I don't find you worthy of my time. And at the beginning, when I said what was at stake in terms of colorism, it's important to think about the impact of things like this on self-esteem of, particularly in this context, black women, and on mental health, because it's extremely negative if you're constructed as being ugly and ignored. Men also, the participants also talked about women with light skin giving them a higher status. And so some of the attraction of having a partner who was mixed race or had light skin was that it would boost their own status. And for those with dark skin who were subjected to colorism, this helped to counter that somewhat. Bilal said, with a lot of black men, you haven't really made it, or you're not really successful until you have obtained a light-skinned or fair-complexioned woman. As a young boy growing up in London, if you're with a pretty light-skinned or mixed-race girl, you'll get a slap on the back from your peers, and people will be like, you've done well, and you'll feel a sense of accomplishment. The participants also constructed skin shade hierarchies, which they put themselves in, and they put women in, and they weren't the same. So in terms of how women were positioned, again, another example from Bilal, he talked about the idea that when he was growing up, first it was seen there was a lot of prejudice against East African women, and they were at the bottom, followed by West Africans, Black Caribbeans, then mixed race, etc. And he said it shifted now, and that East African and Somali women are now very popular and considered attractive and fashionable because they've got the best of both worlds, the Black body and the European features. And when I was talking about proximity to whiteness or distance from whiteness affecting colorism, that's what he's alluding to there. The fact that they have European features means that they're seen as more attractive, more acceptable. In terms of how men were positioned in skin shade hierarchies, Michael said friends with darker skin shades would discuss how skin shade affected employment prospects. So they would compare themselves with him in the kind of, slightly, what seems like a slightly jealous way, saying, you're more likely to get a job than I am because you're a lighter shade and you're nearer to what's the acceptable in terms of those who have the power to employ, which tends to be someone who is white. Similarly, Echo talked about advantages of having light skin in professional contexts. He says, when you're talking about corporate environments, you're more likely to see a lighter skinned Black man in a corporate environment than you are to see a darker skinned Black man in a corporate environment. So in conclusion, how can we challenge colorism? I've highlighted why I think it's such an important issue to address, but how can we go about doing that? So I'm lucky enough to have been awarded a UKRI Future Leaders Fellowship to study understanding colorism in the UK. And I think that that's really important because it gives us an opportunity to increase understanding of how colorism operates here, and particularly at that important age where young people are growing up, those formative years. Lots of our participants highlighted the family and schools as points in their life where they were subjected to the most colorism. So we're hoping that this research will give us a lot more insights into how that operates at schools. And we then would like to raise awareness about that at schools, and also in personal, social health and economic education materials for teachers to use in schools to help young people think differently. And we also would be keen to try and increase understanding in terms of teacher training on the issue of colorism and what it is, how to avoid it, how to help students avoid it. There's a need for much more UK research on colorism, so I'm hoping that there'll be other researchers getting funding as well to do different projects on the issue, which will help to raise awareness and lead to greater understanding. We also need public and industry awareness raising campaigns. It's really important to highlight the issue of colorism, why it matters, and to stop perpetuating certain things. So you see on social media quite a lot jokes around people with dark skin or light skin. It's not only dark skin. You can be quite a lot of negativity towards light skin due to resentments about privilege that's seen as unearned. But neither of those are acceptable or helpful. But we need more awareness of those things. And then in terms of industry, like the media, it needs to challenge. The media needs to challenge their ideas around what is acceptable to present and how people and the opportunities that are given to people of different skin shades. So it's not that we'll just have all the women have to have light skin and curly hair and be mixed race. So that needs to be addressed as well. In terms of holding institutions and companies to account, that's very important too. One of the things that is difficult is that there isn't data on skin shade because it's not collected. So I would argue that you need to collect data on skin shade too, if you're going to then be able to say there's a real issue of colorism in this company. Because if you're not appointing anyone who's got dark skin, that won't be noticed. You could say you've got 100 Black employees, but if every one of those has very pale skin, then you're not addressing colorism. I think colorism should be included in equality, diversity and inclusion commitments, and that there should be industry standards that companies adhere to. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Aisha. That was really interesting, really, and you're getting lots of applause. I don't know if you can see it in the reactions. There's lots of emoji claps coming up at the bottom, which is amazing. I'm now going to open the floor and just see if anyone has any questions. You're more than welcome to raise your hand or unmute or type your question into the chat for Aisha. And just while people are thinking, Aisha, I just had a question that I know has come up before in terms of our own kind of areas of work, in terms of when it's kind of a learned narrative or a narrative that's maybe being handed down in terms of generations. How can we kind of actively disrupt that? at a human level beyond, I guess, the bigger pieces in terms of research?
And that's a really important question. It's a really difficult question because, as we talked about earlier, just the idea of families being a key site where these ideas are perpetuated is difficult, because if your grandparents have lots of colorist views and they pass them down to your parents, and then your parents are still holding on to those, then they'll raise their children in the same way. So that's why I think education campaigns are really important in two areas. So you have to educate people, adults as well as children. So you've got two opportunities to make interventions. So if you don't necessarily get the parent, but you can help children understand it's wrong, then you're making an intervention that means that hopefully the next generation aren't going to be subjected to the same things. But I think that you need both. You need awareness raising campaigns in both areas, and also representation and opportunities for people of all skin shades, so that the ideas and stereotypes around certain skin shades begin to get undermined.
Yeah, I think that's a really good answer, isn't it? It's not a sort of one size fits all. It's kind of approaching it from different angles. I'm just also interested in terms of how you kind of got into this area of research. Like, at what point in your career? Has it always been throughout your career? Is it something that you've looked at a lot recently? And was there a result of that?
I've been writing about colorism for a number of years, just like blogs, different articles. And I've applied for funding before and not got it. And I was told, and I've also pitched articles before and been told, oh, well, there's no issue of colorism in this country. So things have changed immensely in the last decade. But it's been because, as a person of color, your awareness of colorism is from probably, again, from when you're a child, and a family member will make comments that make you aware of how you're not as valuable as someone who has lighter skin. So it's something that I've been aware of my whole life, but as a professional, it's something that I've been keen to do more on for a very long time. Oh, sorry, that was my timer.
No worries, no problem. I know we've got some questions. So I think it was Natalie's hand. Yeah, Natalie's went up first, and then I'll go to Saffron.
First, I just want to say that's awesome. Thank you so much for that. That was just really, really well constructed and really interesting. I suppose so personally, it touches on my research area, and that, like, I study Black women, so it's always about positioning myself and kind of where I fit as a mixed race Black woman into things. So I just found that really interesting, and I think there just needs to be more work on it. And which is, what's next is kind of my vague question. What's next for you in this research process? And then with my other hat on as research impact lead, what are you thinking in terms of kind of that, all those little circles at the end? Do you have routes to kind of moving forward on any of those? Do you have plans on moving forward with any of those? Sorry to attack you with a bunch of questions. I think you're fab.
Thank you so much. So for me, because I'm just at the beginning of this 5-year research project on colorism among young people in the UK, we're going to be doing research at 6 secondary schools, exploring the issue of colorism there, and we'll do a survey of 1,000 young people on their understandings of colorism. So for me, that will take up a lot of my time over the next 5 years, but I would like to be thinking about ways to address all of those points I put on that final slide. I think it's really important, and I think that it's a privilege to be given this funding and to have this opportunity and this platform, and I want to make the most of it.
Thanks, Aisha. Saffron, did you want to ask your question?
Hi, yeah, sorry, I haven't got a camera today, so it's just my voice, but I am here. Thank you so much for that, Aisha. That was really interesting to hear, actually. And as someone who is Black Caribbean, similar complexion to yourself, I've had a lot of these experiences, let's say, growing up in England and going to many different schools. But as I put in my earlier comment, I am going to be joining King's next year to look into teacher education, specifically how it doesn't cover issues such as race and racism when it comes to training newly qualified teachers. Even though England is getting more and more diverse as time goes on, the actual teacher education frameworks haven't really been changing to match that. And in your presentation, you mentioned how you would love to see colorism introduced into teacher education. And I just want to pose the question to you, do you think when teaching about colorism, more understanding would be required by teachers regarding race in general and cultures in general? and it should be taught as a standalone topic, or do you think it can all be covered at once within teacher education? And if so, how would you envisage that happening? Sorry,
really
basically,
question.
can you solve all the issues?
But well, I think it's absolutely crucial that the ideas around race or racialization are taught at the teacher training level. I think it's really, really important. And I've had some friends who've done teacher training, and hearing what they talk about some of their colleagues, the things that they've said, is very worrying to me. So I think it's extremely important that those areas are covered and covered well, and that prospective teachers get a really good understanding of them. I think that you can include colorism, but an understanding of how racialization works and racism will help with that, and help with understanding that. Because if you can't grasp those issues, then you're not going to be able to move on to colorism anyway, I don't think. But I just wanted to say, Saffron, I don't have your email address, but it'd be great if you drop me a line. I'd love to have a discussion with you about your research as well.
Yeah, definitely, 100%. I'm currently applying for funding, so I'm saying this. I should be joining next year if all goes well. But yeah, I'll definitely send you an email. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks, Saffron and Aisha. There's been a few more questions in the chat, Aisha. So Jean says, there is often a desire to have a good suntan, especially in lighter skin individuals. How does this play into the issues of colorism?
And when just a point of clarification, do you mean people with light skin who are people of color, or do you mean white people? Because it can be quite different. Let me just see what the question said.
Hi, I mean white people who want to have a good suntan.
Right. Okay. I don't think that particularly. It's interesting. I'm reading a book at the moment on colorism in education, and one of the things that the authors there have argued that I haven't seen before is that having the palest, someone of color who's got the lighter skin, so a mixed race person with the lighter skin, isn't the desired look. It's a slightly browner skin shade. So I wonder whether or not that's part of this brown. I think Shirley Ann Tate might write about this. There's kind of a brown ideal that people are going for, and I don't think it necessarily feeds into colorism, but I think that there is something about this sort of brown tone of skin that's seen as extremely beautiful that people aspire to have. For white people, it can be seen as an affluent thing that you can travel abroad and you get a suntan. For black people, for people of color, it can be seen as having better skin than if you have a darker skin shade. But I hadn't read before about people of color, mixed race people who have very, very light skin being sometimes not seen as the most desired. So I'd like to read more about that.
We've also got a question, Gilda. I don't know if you want to unmute and ask Aisha your question directly.
Thanks, Aisha, for such a great talk today. I really enjoyed it. I was just wondering, in terms of kind of hiring practices, how can employers be better in terms of not allowing colorism to judge? Because you mentioned how darker skinned black men are much less likely to be in corporate environments. So how can they kind of get away from being influenced by colorism? Does that make sense in terms of hiring practices?
No, the question's really clear, and it's a good question. I think it's the same as the ideas about racism and hiring, because if you're going to look at your candidates and think, oh, I don't really fancy that Asian person, that Muslim, that black person, that's an issue. But if you're aware of it, even if you might have prejudice, if you're aware of it and don't want to act on that, then you have to be really conscious of the fact that those views might be affecting how you make your decisions. Equally, if you're thinking of people of color, and I've spoken a lot today about black people, but let's say we're just talking about black people, and you think of them as all the same, then you won't be attentive to prioritizing people because of their skin shade. But if you think about colorism existing, then you might think, why do I think that these two people with the same qualifications, this one is much more intelligent than the other one? The only difference between them being that this one has darker skin and this one has lighter skin. So it's about education and about interrogating what leads to decision making, because there's a lot of stereotypes that lead to people making assumptions. A lot of work written about people with light skin being seen as more intelligent. If you have that view, when you're hiring and you're on a panel, you're going to think, well, that one's got lighter skin, they're brighter, we'll have that one. And it's about interrupting those processes and challenging them.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Sarah, there was a question. I'm hoping it's Sarah. It might be Sarah. I wanted to see if you wanted to ask Aisha your question.
Yes, sure. Thank you. Yes, it's Sarah, by the way. Thanks. Thanks for asking. Thank you so much, Aisha, and especially for restoring my hopes in sort of sensible research investment and research funding going in. Very interesting project. I wanted to ask you if you could say anything more about intersectionality. I was really struck by some of your participants. I don't know if it was always the same person, but saying things like obtaining women. And I just thought, I wondered how you deal with things like the, patriarchal ways of thinking, intersecting with colorism, with possibly other forms of oppressive mindsets. It's an open question in terms of, I'm curious. I'd like to hear more about how you deal with that.
I think that's a brilliant question as well. What was really interesting was the complexity within those interviews. So with even just looking at that group of 9 men, you had men who talked about being subjected to colorism and the impact of that on them. And then they spoke about subjecting women to colorism themselves, and also other men to colorism. And then they also talked about the way in which they were objectified by white women. So in some ways, so that's as you mentioned, it's really important to think intersectionally, because in some ways they were positioned in privileged ways. They were privileged over those Black women who they dismissed and rejected and were negative towards. They were also privileged over those men with even darker skin who they could be colorist towards. But then they were also objectified. Like one man told me how he was there were the assumptions that he would just be available to any white woman who wanted him, and they saw him as a very sort of, he was an object, he wasn't a human. And it was, although he was supposedly attractive, it was dehumanizing and very made him really uncomfortable. So as much as he benefited from some of that stereotyping around dark skin being attractive and virile, it was also a really unpleasant and kind of violating experience for him. So there were power dynamics at play that were not constant. They were shifting and also related, and they were contextual. So it depended on how they were positioned in relation to the 2 different people. So as I mentioned, the woman with light skin who said to Malachi, "You're dark, you're ugly, I don't find you attractive," that is positioning, that's positioning him in a position of inferiority in relation to her. She's using her light skin privilege to say that she's better than him, at the same time as he didn't do this, but some of the other men with dark skin were denigrating other women, Black women with dark skin, because they wanted themselves to feel better and to feel empowered and to have power over them. So it was very complex.
Thank you so much for that. It sounds like, I imagine, like analytically a nightmare in the sense of all the number of factors you need to take into account, but also incredibly fascinating, and best of luck with it. It sounds like an amazing project. Thank you for sharing.
Thanks so much, and thank you for your question.
We've got a hand raised from Sham, and I think this will be the last question or comment. Sham, if you want to unmute.
Aisha, thank you very much for a great presentation. At my last institution, we spent a long time looking at the BAME category, this umbrella term, and looked at the different items in that umbrella term, and colorism came up. What we found when we were sort of analysing the complexity involved is when you sort of look at ethnicity and how that's interpreted, and you juxtapose that with phenotyping. So you've mentioned how one's nose or lips, as well as colour, may influence. We sort of picked up the fact that some ethnicities, for example, the Caribbean community, are seen as very aggressive and hostile, even though they have lighter skin, compared to, as you mentioned, the East Africans, who were seen as more willing and able. So it's really interesting how some stereotypes sort of transcend the colorism from white to Black. So it's going to be really difficult to sort of identify to what extent pigmentocracy or the transition from light to dark actually is a factor. And I was just wondering how you're going to be able to pinpoint it, that this is actually the factor which we need to sort of highlight and address, as opposed to other factors in terms of, we mentioned intersectionality, and then pinpointing which ones of those are actually the ones we need to do better education around and capture.
Oh, well, there's a lot in that question, and it's a really good one. What I immediately wanted to say was what you just said there highlights an issue with my final slide about how would you address colorism, because it's not enough simply to say capture, as you said, skin shade, because that doesn't capture those other features which have an impact. So it's extremely complicated. So I don't have an answer for that one. But in terms of the broader part of your question, how can you address these issues and be sure that colorism is playing an impact? I think you need to contextualize. I think it's all going to come down to context and look at the stereotypes around different groups, as well as how skin shade and features are having an impact on how people are positioned and the opportunities that they're getting. But that requires work, and it does require that contextualization. It's not going to be very valuable without it. But I think that it's really important that the points that you've raised around stereotyping and how certain groups are seen in certain ways, that is also really important to take into account. And the fact that colorism doesn't affect every single ethnicity and every single ethnic group in the same way.
It was really hard for us to make any recommendations, particularly to the employer, around colorism. So we ended up sort of saying, recognise that umbrella term is diverse, and we need to make sure that we have representation across the different ethnic groups that we identified, which were Black heritage, and that's as far as we could get.
I think more can be done than that, because you can also, if you say, for example, I think you mentioned Caribbean people with light skin. Obviously, Caribbean people can have extremely dark skin too. So if you're looking within that ethnic group, you can think about how, even if there are stereotypes around Caribbean men in general, the fact that those with light skin were still getting better opportunities than those with dark skin, if that was the case. So you can still look at how skin shade is impacting on within each of those ethnic groups the opportunities, but it is complicated. It's not an easy thing to do.
It was actually the fact that the Caribbean were just put way down on the list because they were seen as hostile, aggressive, less easy to work with, and it was just really sad to kind of see how those stereotypes are still manifesting, and this is a generation upon generation issue. So honestly, we couldn't we identified pigmentocracy, colorism, but it was really hard to make any recommendations. Happy to share with you some of the research we produced.
I would love that if you would. Yeah, please do get in contact with me. That would be really valuable. Yes, please.
You're most welcome. I look forward to it.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, everyone. I'm just conscious of the time, and I know Fiona's got a question, but I'm going to just ask that if I share that with Aisha after the event, Fiona, I'm sure she won't mind coming back to you via email.
Definitely.
Just so amazing. Thanks, Aisha. Just so we finish on time. Well, we're running slightly behind, only by 1 minute, so we're all good. So huge thank you, Aisha, for that amazing presentation, and for contributing to our Festival of Disruptive Thinking. It's been so insightful and so great to have such a kind of disruptive conversation at a lunchtime on a Tuesday midweek. So really grateful for your insight and for sharing your research. And huge thank you to everyone who has joined us today and for asking your questions and for being part of the conversation. There's still time to register for other upcoming events in our Festival of Disruptive Thinking series, which is taking place this week. And we're going to share a link to the website now in the chat box. So please take a look at that if you haven't already. And we'll also share a link to subscribe to the Entrepreneurship Institute newsletter, which is probably the best way to find out about other events just like this. But all that's left for me to say is a huge thank you again to Aisha, a huge thank you for all of you to joining us, and have a lovely rest of the afternoon and a lovely rest of the evening as well.
Thank you very much.